Well, History 103 students, welcome to week number 8. One little side note here, for some reason my headphones that I ordinarily wear over my head are not picking up the audio. So it may be that the audio that I'm using on my webcam doesn't record at quite a higher level. So you might have to crank up the sound a little bit to hear me for the next couple minutes. So week 8, just a couple more weeks to go. But this week is a research week, so you just have the one paper to write plus the quiz. We've finished with World War I, the interwar period, and World War II, and now we're going to start with the Cold War. So that period of time, 45 years or so after the end of World War II. So that's what we'll be studying for the rest of I guess for the next 2 weeks or so. The last chapter is on the post-Cold War period. So when people talk about World War I, World War II, they talk about those two wars as being a total war. And there are a number of characteristics of a total war, and I'll just kind of name just a couple of them. One is that in a total war, everybody contributes in some way. So you think about America's involvement in World War II. We certainly sent troops over um, to Europe. Also, they fought in the Pacific theater as well too. But individuals in the homeland contribute as well too. Um, for example, there were metal drives and there were rubber drives. So those sorts of materials that were used in the war effort, they were rationed and or they were collected from citizens. Citizens were asked to buy war bonds, which were loans to the government. In addition, another kind of a weird example is Americans were asked to eat more cottage cheese rather than beef or chicken or fish, so that those cuts could go over to the troops. So everybody contributes in a total war. Another kind of characteristic of total war is that the economy, a nation's economy, um, becomes a war economy as opposed to a peacetime economy that would produce goods for consumers. So, wartime economy. And one of the things that you'll probably read about in this chapter is this kind of transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime consumer-based economy. Another characteristic is that a total war typically involves the world. Right? I mean, we already know that European powers had colonized major portions of Asia and pretty much all of Africa. And so there were war theaters, there were battles that took place in those areas. So very few places, very few nation states were untouched by World War II. And then another very important characteristic is that in a total war, there's little distinction made between combatants, so those individual servicemen and servicewomen who are part of the military, and non-combatants, just your citizen on the road. And certainly this is clear in a number of kind of major bombings that the Allies participated in, the atomic bombings. Good examples of that, right? A couple 100,000 individuals died, and the vast majority of those were non-combatants. The Dresden bombing is another great example. There's a picture of it on page 912 showing the destruction. Vast majority of the victims were non-combatants. Germany's bombing of London during the Blitz, vast majority of those victims were non-combatants. So total war, those are kind of some characteristics of total war to keep in mind. Of course, a lot of casualties during World War II, and you can see I'm just kind of recapping some things about World War II as we transition into the Cold War. But casualties, of course, major in World War II. Just thought I'd kind of list a couple of them for you. So Soviet Union, 27 million dead, right, representing 14% of the population. Poland, 6 million dead, representing 17% of the population. China, 20 million dead, representing 3% of the population. Germany, 7 million dead, representing 8% of the population. The United States lost about 400,000 individuals, representing an amount smaller than 1% of the population. As I was saying earlier, though, however, this is a worldwide war. And oftentimes when people think about World War II, they think of it as kind of taking place in Europe or the Pacific. But there were colonies that had some pretty significant losses as well, too. Dutch East Indies. British East Indies, 4 million killed, representing 5% of the population. French Indochina, 2 million killed, representing 5% of the population. And India lost 2 million individuals as well, too. So major casualties, talking about deaths here, all total anywhere from 70 to 85 million lives lost. Of course, that's just deaths. Typically in these sorts of things, you can assume that the number of wounded is twice the deaths. Plus, you can just imagine all the refugees and those individuals who are pushed out of their homes. So, you know, probably a good estimate would be 300 million individuals directly impacted by this total war. That image that I just kind of talked about on page 912, Dresden, just of course massive structural destruction in Europe as well as Japan, China, throughout the world from bombings. Certainly not every major city is going to look like Dresden there, but many of them did. So quite a bit of destruction in Germany, Poland, Austria, Italy, Japan. I mean, totaling tens of billions of dollars. And as your book points out, I mean, it takes time to remove the rubble, right, and begin rebuilding again. You think about, you know, armistice, right, victory and peace, Japan, victory and peace in Europe. But what comes afterwards? And your book points out that there's a good year or more in which Europeans and other individuals struggled with just trying to survive. The book points out that food was rationed in Europe, coal was rationed, so there wasn't enough to keep people warm during that winter of 1946. So some pretty rough times for a couple of years in Europe after World War II. It's not like everything just kind of flipped immediately and everyone began flourishing and working again. Another thing your book points out in those first couple of pages is, you know, with all the destruction, governance systems need to be, you know, relaunched, need to be resurrected. Legal systems, right? Whole economies need to be rebuilt, right? I mean, look at that picture in Dresden, right? I mean, factories, right, just gone. So unemployment is going to be high in those periods for quite a while those factories, those economies are being rebuilt. So quite a bit of time setting up those governance system, legal systems, economies. The book points out that the Marshall Plan was a major contributor to the rebuilding of Europe. United States, you know, being 3,000 miles away and really only getting involved in the war at the very end, really comes out relatively unscathed and is the major power remaining after World War II. And so it's the nation that has the money to lend or provide as aid to Europe to facilitate that rebuilding. The book talks about the United States gave $14 billion over a couple of years. In 2015 dollars, that represents about $170 billion, which is a pretty good sized chunk. That represents about 10 times America's current annual foreign aid. So that was, as I said, a pretty good chunk of money that the United States of America provided to Europe to help with the rebuilding there. Another theme that the book talks about is this great alignment that comes, and that when you talk about the Cold War, right? I mean, think about a war between two opposing parties, individuals, groups. So the two superpowers that arise out of World War II, United States of America, democratic, capitalist United States of America, and then the Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union. And so it's those two powers and their allies that are going to animate um, international politics until 1990, maybe even beyond, but Cold War pretty much ends in 1990. And if you look on page 913 of your textbook, you'll see a map there showing kind of this initial Iron Curtain, or this initial kind of bifurcation in Europe. And you can see that kind of red and maroon line that splits the East from the West, and of course it's splitting East Germany from West Germany. And flip over to 926, you get a better image of this bifurcation. So you've got the communist East, right, led by the Soviet Union, the whole kind of red area in the upper right-hand corner. But then you have its satellites, its independent allies. So Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. They're independent nations, but more or less under pretty significant control coming from Moscow. So that's the Eastern Bloc. All right, talking about the Warsaw Pact. All right, Western Bloc, you're talking about United Kingdom, Norway, France, West Germany, Italy, etc., and of course the United States. So that's kind of the the two major groups. You can see that there are orange-colored nation-states there, the so-called non-aligned states, and there were non-aligned states. But for the most part, during the Cold War, the vast majority of nation states, either voluntarily or compelled or by incentives, chose to align themselves either with the East, Soviet Union, or the West, United States of America. When you're reading through this chapter, I would encourage you to pay special attention to the first, 10 or so pages, at least until it gets up to Khrushchev and the thaw. The first kind of 10 pages provides a really good kind of background to the Cold War. And right before that Khrushchev section begins, there's a discussion of another kind of important key word from the Cold War, and that's containment. That idea that the West, the United States of America, put forward of containing communism. So when you think about wars like the Vietnam War, Korean War, right, containing, constraining, limiting the spread or expansion of communism. But it's a word that we're hearing more and more these days as well, too, as Western countries think about responding to ISIS. And some people have been talking about not conquering, destroying ISIS, but containing its spread. And then the last kind of major theme of this chapter has to do with decolonization, and that is what your essay is on this week. And page 931 has a great map there showing the independence movements in Asia. And then just flip over the next page, 932. You can see how Africa, pretty much the entire thing, goes through a decolonization period during the 50s and 60s. So I think that's about it for this chapter. Enjoy the week and enjoy writing your essay. Looking forward to reading some great essays on decolonization.